it's for Anne Arundel County, it's as close as we get to I wouldn't say it's ultra urban, but a pretty highly urbanized setting. Lots of, municipalities, older municipalities have these floodways that people think of as, they've always got to be that way because we've got to worry about getting flood pulses downstream. And even in the relatively narrow corridor that we had to work within here, we were able to create a stable stream and wetland platform. And again, it's a function of whether or not you can do it is something you can understand by using those 2D models and other engineering tools that we now have at our disposal in terms of being able to design for the energies that are coming through systems like these. So that's the riprap spillway that showed up as purple and red in that image that I showed. So this is an area in Glen Burnie, which is just one of the suburbs to Baltimore City, where again, where the the watershed was developed in the 1950s and 60s, a little bit further down that, where there is not much stormwater management. That one, yep. Other than what has been retrofitted in that watershed, it's probably about a 40% impervious watershed in terms of what's going on there. This is the downstream reach as of 2 weeks ago in terms of photos of that. And if I told you that was, in, the Dismal Swamp or something like that, you probably wouldn't have too much trouble believing me unless you really know your vegetation well. So the opportunities, again, are there even in systems that we think of as really, really challenging and probably beyond salvation in terms of restoration. So it's always exciting to do those. One of the other things that we're doing, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later on in the presentation, is trying to use more naturalized approaches. So this is a project that we did on the South River involving beaver dam analogs. So basically staked in debris jams essentially in the stream to bring the stream up, get floodplain connection. It's a strategy that's been used elsewhere in the county over the course of the past several years now. This is a site, not the same site, but a site that's a bit older where what we hoped would happen has happened, which is beaver have actually come in on top of those debris jams and set up shop as well. And so it's neat to see these systems evolve over time. It's neat to try to deploy lower cost, lower impact strategies and see how those work in this context. And it really is a lot of opportunities out there in terms of restoration. One of the things that I've enjoyed a lot is not just the restoration, but trying to figure out how to take advantage of environmental markets. Ward Oberholzer and I were talking a little bit at lunch about how, and I think we came to agreement that really the industry and any industry innovates when times are tough. And I would say that times have been very cushy for the past 10 years in terms of the industry locally in Maryland. There's been a lot of money. There's been not a huge supply of labor on the design and contracting side necessarily, at least initially, to do that. And so there was an opportunity. There wasn't necessarily a lot of incentive to try to improve practice within the industry. And so for us, taking advantage of some other tools, and this is a tool that we created locally, is full delivery contracting, basically like a design, build, deliver, maintain model, essentially, where all of the risk really is outsourced to the private sector to give us turnkey projects, has helped put us back into the driver's seat in terms of procurement and in terms of implementation and being able to get a little bit better handle on some of this work. And so we've had a program in place for about 6 or 7 years now locally, where we have been able to use this procurement mechanism. I can just ask you to advance the slides. Okay, there you go. probably going to advance 20 at once or something. So we've been able to use that to do a variety of kinds of projects, all on private property. One of the requirements of this procurement mechanism is that the work be done on private property. Anne Arundel County is a waterfront community. We've got about 530 miles of water frontage. So there's a lot of opportunities for living shoreline creation. That's been one of the popular mechanisms that's been employed through this effort. And we've gotten a tremendous amount of work done at a lower cost to the county in a much quicker way than the county's traditional procurement. I think one of the speakers earlier talked about how government tends to move pretty slowly, and that's certainly true. These are a few of those projects. This is another Holly Beach Farm living shoreline. That's Chesapeake Bay Bridge in the background there. Just a ground level shot of that same kind of image. And so again, on private property, it's difficult to necessarily get access, but having the implementer be able to negotiate that on the front end and then be able to undertake this work with the incentive to get it done quickly has been a real boon to our efforts. One of the neat things about Maryland's MS4 permit is that it actually allows for a variety of best management practices to constitute restoration practices. So shoreline enhancements are one of them. Actually, septic to sewer conversion or septic upgrade work is another, results in significant nitrogen reductions. So we were able to fund a project to connect the equivalent of about 250 septic systems to the public sewer network for some commercial developers who were looking to do that for business purposes and who contributed significantly to the effort to drive down the cost. We've been able to use it to do some stream restoration as well, which is another practice that's allowed. And these are just some numbers in terms of the cost per acre treated. The impervious acres treated is the metric for our stormwater permit and is a proxy for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. And so you can see the full delivery costs. They've ranged a bit, but they've been in the neighborhood of about 35 to 40% of sort of the lowest cost practices in terms of conventional design bid build efforts for the county. So that's been a really big benefit for us and an opportunity created by the demand to get this work done as fast as it's been done. Another that Maryland has toyed with and has been bandied about elsewhere is nutrient credit trading. This is oyster aquaculture in Maryland. Oyster aquaculture can be used to generate water quality credits. We've purchased some credits from oyster aquaculture in the past, but it's still not really at a level and scale in Maryland, at least on the western shore of Maryland, where it's a sustainable, reliable credit generator. But that's another step people are taking to sort of get their feet wet in this space. One of the big things that we've been able to do too is engage a broad swath of partners. So we've got a grant program that we run through the Chesapeake Bay Trust. So we take some of our money from our stormwater fee each year, put it in the Chesapeake Bay Trust for restoration grant programs. And local organizations, including community associations or watershed groups or religious institutions, are able to utilize that funding to undertake water quality projects that the county can ultimately get credit for in terms of its water quality restoration efforts. We're able to fund some innovative, interesting efforts. This is a living shoreline on the South River where they used oyster-seeded reef balls to try to create breakwaters for a living shoreline. Further south than here, it's a fairly widespread practice to use oyster bags as part of living breakwaters. There's some question as to whether in the mid-Atlantic winters are too brutal in order to have that work as a strategy. But we thought it was worth giving it a shot here in terms of funding that effort. That's actually Joe Berg in that picture there pointing across the stream. This is a project that Biohabitats was involved with Arundel Rivers Federation, where they used those beaver dam analogs essentially in a tributary to the South River to bring that system up and to do restoration there at a much reduced cost, also having a low carbon footprint in terms of the effort that's gone on. So we've been able to really fund some neat work that's been a little bit more provisional than maybe things that we would otherwise undertake initially, at least. And then I think really one of the important elements of our grant program has been as an ability to engage underserved communities. So we've worked with a number of churches throughout the county where we initially get brought in or partners get brought in response to a drainage problem or some kind of issue that's focused on flooding or other kinds of issues. In this case, there was a sort of a stormwater conveyance going through the church's graveyard, and it was actually creating unearthing sort of like historical graves as a result of floods and being uncontrolled. And so one of our nonprofit partners was able to work with them to do water quality treatment and then also create a safe conveyance through the graveyard so that they no longer had those issues, and created a number of stewards in that community as well as a result. And then I think one of the things, especially sort of in suburban Maryland, maybe that we lose sight of is that ability to work with agricultural partners. So a lot of times ag efforts are consigned to the eastern shore of Maryland, where there's lots of agricultural operations still underway. But in many of the suburban counties, there are still at least significant pieces of the geography that are agricultural as well. In this case, these are actually sod farms. And you can see, well, maybe you can't see, but the tributary on the left actually was restored as a result of the Severn Riverkeeper working with this landowner to install a series of seepage wetlands, which were described in one of the earlier presentations to arrest sediment coming off the stream, and then the unrestored reach on the right, which, albeit is a bigger tributary, you can see contributing significant amounts of sediment to the local waterway during the storm event. So there's an opportunity to engage the ag sector, although just as a rule, maybe stereotypically, the ag sector can be kind of cagey about engaging, especially with government outside soil conservation districts and that sort of thing. But I think as the money is on the table and the opportunities are there, there's a better chance to engage as well. One of the other things that we've been doing, because we know we can't do it alone, is really trying to figure out ways to get nature to do the heavy lifting. Nature is doing the heavy lifting in a lot of ways. In Anne Arundel County, and I think throughout much of Maryland, beaver have made a tremendous comeback even over the course of the last 10 years. So from the Baltimore City line to the Calvert County line in the south and on the Patuxent River, beaver are back big time. And as you can imagine, again, in a suburban county or even in an urban area, that can create conflicts, and it does create conflicts. And so I think the issue, especially as resource managers and as people, my organization is cited within our Department of Public Works, so we've got utilities folks and roadways folks, and their jobs are to make sure that there's not I&I getting into the sewer network or that their roads aren't flooding and that kind of thing. But going into this kind of thing with the approach or the perspective that if we can adaptively manage with the beaver, they can provide us some benefits, I think can be a big benefit to us because they are doing a lot of work on their own. One of the things that we've begun working on with Scott McGill at Ecotone and some other folks in Maryland is trying to pitch the case that beaver ponds should be able to be treated like a best management practice, like any other conventionally installed best management practice. And we've laid out some frameworks for that. There's a good scientific basis for that. You know, some of the research has even been done locally. We have the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, which is a research organization in Edgewater, just south here. They've been studying their site since the 1970s. In the 80s and 90s, they actually had beaver come into one of their stream systems that had been sampled for decades, and were able to do a study where they were looking at the reductions of nutrients and sediment in those systems versus a paired reach, controlled reach that they had. And probably not surprising to anybody here that they found that there were significant reductions in terms of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment compared to the control, and that those benefits, are legitimate, and there's a way for us to basically create sort of a conservative estimate of what we would expect those to do. And so as local governments like ours decide, well, do we want to go in and rip out the beaver dam to get the citizens off our back? Or in some cases, like this one, the citizens actually liked having the beaver dam there. They just wanted it lowered a little bit. We were able to say, okay, well, let's invest the money in a pond leveler, and you can see the pipe here, and put that in, keep the beaver pond there because there's benefits in this watershed. And then trying to figure out, well, okay, how do we calculate the economic benefits of that? And you don't need to pay attention to the details of this slide, but we've come up with a methodology based on essentially the volumes and efficiencies of wet stormwater ponds and applying that to the volume of beaver ponds as measured, and looking at sort of the amount of credit that we're likely to get. In this case, the theoretical value of the pond that I just showed you there was about $400,000, equivalent in terms of a capital project that we might have done. And that's probably conservative, honestly. And the cost of us to do some adaptive management there for a few years was about $8,000. Put the pond leveler in, pay for a few hundred dollars, maybe to $1,000 a year for maintenance to make sure it's kept clear, keep the neighbors happy, and keep the pond in place. There's an economic case in many instances to keep these features in place if we can assign an economic value to them, because that's the currency that local governments operate in, most governments operate in. And it's sort of one last item, and it was referenced, I think, in some of the earlier presentations too, was I think one of the things that we really need to do as well in terms of letting nature do the heavy lifting is making sure that we're putting in protections in place for those areas where the natural resources exist. So obviously there's protections for streams and wetlands, but oftentimes the protections for our floodplain areas leave a lot to be desired, especially once you're out of the FEMA floodplain mapped areas. A lot of local governments do not have floodplain areas above those FEMA mapped areas necessarily called out, and may rely on site development engineers or others to identify those when development projects come through the pipeline. And so one of the things that we've done is work with our local land use agencies to create estimated floodplain areas so that they have a way to flag development projects as they come in, to make sure that we're not developing in those flood prone areas, and to ideally have them carved out either as easements or fee simple donations to the county as part of development projects. And so there are definitely opportunities in terms of the GIS tools that we've got at our disposal now, which are just always constantly amazing me, and the folks who know how to use those effectively. There's a dramatic amount of work that can be done with those that would have been financially unfeasible previously. And so, all of us do this, I think, because we get personal enjoyment out of it. Hopefully we like the thoughts of ultimately recovering the resources that we're working on and seeing the aggregate impacts of our work. And so I enjoy the opportunity to get to talk to you about the things that we're doing, and to get to hear about what you're doing, and to continue pursuing this work for as long as the resources exist to allow us. So thanks so much. Yeah, it's a good question. So it was identified as part of our watershed assessments for our MS4 work and for our TMDL work. So by any stretch, it was at the end of its usable life. I mean, it was cracking up. The sort of end of it had snapped off as a result of having been undercut by, just sort of undercutting itself over time. So it was at the end of its usable life, but that alone would not have been a driver for it. It was a multi-million-dollar project, as you can imagine. And so we thought, well, look, nobody's going to complain. This should be a permitting, breeze in terms of the impacts. And so we were able to move it forward. But one of the frustrations, I guess, from my perspective was, usually if you're restoring a stream or you've got some kind of erosion going on, you've got a sediment and phosphorus load associated with that. This was stable. So in some respects, the project was sort of undercredited from a prevented pollution perspective, in the same way that like daylighting a system would be undercredited. And so most of the credit that we got was from really like the inline wetland processing of the system, as opposed to sediment reduction, which is where a lot of times the heavy numbers come from, with the stream project. Even all that being said, we thought it was a worthwhile project to do. one, because the community was an area that had been underinvested in historically. There weren't lots of upland stormwater management opportunities. I think as a showcase project showing people what you can do, there's a power to that too. That does bring up a good point, which is to say, there's a lot of focus on sort of equity investment and those kinds of things now with government resources. And in terms of stormwater, it's natural because a lot of those older communities, maybe sometimes poorer communities, are areas where there almost is no stormwater management or has been none. So it's an opportunity to use your stormwater program to achieve some of those kinds of goals, because that's where those investments are going to make the most sense from a pollution reduction standpoint as well. So, yes, ma'am. So is Ward still here? I've got a great Ward story. So there's a project that's right around the corner here where it was a valley restoration project that Ward was doing with Century at the time, where the project, as originally designed, had no channel in it because we recognize we don't want a channel. The channel is just dewatering the wetlands that we're putting in the system. So we don't want to get one, or we don't want to put one in. MDE, the state regulators, forced us to put one in as sort of a design revision. It was actually an SHA project. They forced us to put one in as a design revision. And the site looks great. I mean, it's, the banks are this high or whatever. And it's mostly riparian wetlands, but still to this day, the channel is dewatering the wetlands. Like, it's just allowing water to get through that system quicker. Is undesirable from my perspective. But to your point, we've gotten to the point with the Corps and with NE now where we've had discussions to say, look, guys, we're not going to put a channel in these systems. Are you okay with that? We know water is going to get from the top of the system to the bottom of the system. We don't know how it's going to get there, what path it's going to take, but we don't have to worry about that happening. How about if we come back a year or 18 months after the restoration project's done and map out for you where the channel is, to just show you we haven't lost any channel length as a result of that project. But it's been a ongoing, lengthy discussion, and actually I really appreciate you asking the question, not a silly question at all. Goes back to that sort of regulatory framework. We've got a regulatory apparatus that divides our resources that should be integrated. Streams and wetlands are part of the same system. To say we're converting a stream to a wetland or a wetland to a stream, I mean, that's a silly conversation. They should be working, hand in glove in terms of being effective, but we've got a regulatory system that can divide them if we're not careful. So I'm very sympathetic to that discussion, and it's been one that's been ongoing, but I just say be persistent about it. Yeah, Joe. That's a part of it. Go back and you adopt that approach. Yeah, well, I like the way you think, Joe. Yeah, I mean, what Joe's talking about, if for folks who aren't familiar with the Bay sort of efforts, is Protocol 5 is focused on outfall restoration. So it's an area where you've got not just sort of the lateral migration of the channel, but you've likely got sort of a wedge of sediment that's being lost as that vertically cuts back towards the outfall area. And so there is a prevented sediment element of, and I think it's about sort of just a question of sort of like the time scale of when that sediment loss is likely to occur. And I'm also not a big fan of like tinkering too much with the crediting mechanisms for nutrient and sediment reduction, because I think we don't want to water it down by trying to achieve other goals. But if there are other goals that are sort of ends in themselves, we should figure out a way to recognize those and incentivize those too. So daylighting, 1,000 feet of stream and creating a stream and wetland complex obviously has huge habitat benefits, maybe beyond what the sediment reduction benefits would be. And how do we assign a value to that? So, yeah, it's a good point. Thanks.
I did not check for anybody online. Do a quick check. Sorry, Amy, about the questions. Nope, there was someone saying they couldn't hear the questions, but you still got the answer to them. Again, thank you, Eric. Thank you, everybody. This is the long day, so I made sure we had a free happy hour open bar afterwards, so you all get to celebrate and relax a little bit. So that's starting right away. If you want to head over or head back to your rooms, it'll be going on for the next couple hours, and we'll pick back up in the morning. Thanks, everybody.